Okay, so this is the very first time I've spoken on women's issues with the majority of men in the audience, so I'm very happy about that. Usually there's no men, or 2 or 3 who come with their partners. So, so that's good. That's very good. It's a good. I think it's a good sign for CAP, and that men who are engaged in CAP are interested in women's participation. So that's good. So what I'm going to do is. I spent a lot of my life, in part, promoting more women in politics, and I myself have run for office a couple of times. And I've kind of changed my approach over the years to women's participation in politics. So I'm going to talk to you about the sort of traditional, if you want, feminist approach to this, and then talk about what I think needs to happen. The first thing is that, you know, it's the 40th anniversary, as well as being, well, you know, some people are saying it's the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. I don't think so, but more like the 90-something, because it was created by Clara Zetkin. It was started by Clara Zetkin, who was a socialist feminist in Russia, and probably the most important woman leader of the Russian Revolution. But when it really became an event, I think she probably proposed it 100 years ago, but it became an event after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, in which 103 immigrant women were killed in a fire where the employer had locked the doors in New York City. And she proposed it to honor those women. And as far as I know, that fire was in 1913. So I don't think it's the 100th anniversary, but anyway. So in any case, but I do know the year that it started in Canada, because I was part of starting it in Canada, and that was 1973. And in 1973, a group of us who were socialist feminists, so we knew about it, proposed that we have a march every year on International Women's Day. And that started in 1973, and it's become a yearly event ever since, and often very large. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was often more than 5,000 people on that march, sometimes 10,000. And this year, it actually was the biggest it's been in a long time. I think it was about 2,500 women on Saturday, which is a sign, I think, just like CAP is a sign that something's happening in this country, and people are going back to the streets, which I think is a good thing. I mean, some people might not think it's a good thing because it's a sign that the governments are completely intractable, so the only way you can have your voice heard is to go into the streets. But that's been true for a long time, and it's just this year and last year where people have started to organize again. So I'm very, very happy for that, and people know I've written about CAP and how positive I feel about CAP, because I've been writing for 20 years about the limitations of Canadian democracy, and I've been thinking we need a democracy movement for a long time, and I think that CAP represents that potential. So it is the 40th anniversary also of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which reported in 1970, and the Royal Commission was a very important moment in Canadian history, because it was a rare thing when a government, under pressure, set up a Royal Commission, and the hearings of that Royal Commission corresponded with the beginnings of the formation of the women's movement. And so women used the Royal Commission hearings as a way to talk about what they were facing in their lives. And the impact of that was to radicalize the commissioners, only one of whom considered herself a feminist at the time. Most of them were not feminists. They were women, but they were not feminists. But because of what they heard about the lives of women, because of course the members of the Royal Commission were quite privileged women, they became feminists. And if you look at the Royal Commission report, which I highly recommend, just you don't have to look at the whole thing, but just the recommendation, it was pretty ahead of its time in many ways. It called for legalized abortion. It called for a national child care program, which we still don't have. It called for a large increase of women in Parliament, because actually it so happened the year that the Royal Commission reported, there was only one woman in Parliament. There had been more before, but there was only one woman, and there was a significant increase after that to about 7 or 10 the election after that, or 2 elections after that. And the Royal Commission saw women's participation in politics as of primary importance if we were to achieve women's equality. And that's, that is true in terms of the index that the UN does on the status of women in society, that the number of women in the legislatures is an important sign of the extent of equality for women. I actually think that's not true, because I think they have more women in Afghanistan parliament than they have in Canadian parliament, which is interesting considering that our government claims to be in Afghanistan to promote women's equality, and Canada has one of the worst records. Canada, the United States, and Great Britain actually the worst records in the Western world on women in politics. And what's happening now is that in the global South, they're moving much quicker than we are on women in politics. And the main reason for that is quotas. And the places where women, like for example in Scandinavia, where you have 40 to 50% women, not quite 50, but between 40 and 50% women in parliament, and women prime ministers, and women cabinet, large numbers of women cabinet ministers, it's because they have quotas. And they have quotas and lists. They have proportional representation. I know somebody else talked about that, so I'm not going to get into that. But the fact of the matter is, wherever there's proportional representation, there's a higher representation of women in parliament, because it's easier to have quotas. And in all the research that's been done in Canada, the #1 barrier, institutional barrier to women in politics, women getting nominated, getting elected, is the nomination process. Because it's at a riding level, and people think that ridings are democratic, but they're not. In my opinion, they're not. They're local, that's true, but all too often, especially now when we don't really have much political life in our parties, they're very top down, they're very run by parliamentary caucus, a leader especially. So there's not like these kinds of discussions that we're having today. They don't happen in the political parties anymore. They used to, especially in the NDP. You used to have policy debates at a riding level. It doesn't happen really anymore in that way. So the riding's not very interesting, and the people who get involved in the riding tend to be political junkies, and there tend to be more male political junkies and women political junkies for whatever reason we can speculate on. And I hope that's not the reason. There's more men than women in the room, but anyway, and or as many. And so it's at the riding level that it's very hard to have quotas if the ridings are responsible for electing women, because then you have the situation of the Liberals where the leader sort of says, you have to elect a woman, and it doesn't go down very well. So we have failed utterly to improve the representation of women. And it's not just at the federal level. We used to think, oh, it's more at the federal level because, women are more responsible for caring for children and they don't want to go to Ottawa, but it's not. It's the same. It's the same now. It's the same at the federal level, the provincial level, and the municipal level. We have 28 people running for mayor of the city. 27 are men. Okay? So what does that tell us? And I would say it tells us something about women and something about men. Not to stereotype, but men tend to think, well, should I say men tend to think they're better than they are, and women tend to think they're not as good as they are. One of the things, when I did Face Off, which was a debate show on CBC Newsworld. It was a left-right debate show. We did it for 4 years, every night. And in 4 years, there was never a man who said, I'm not expert enough to come on the show. And at least 50% of women we asked would say that. At least, and men of color, by the way, would say that. Maybe 25% of men of color, but not as